Good evening, and I want to start with something that might quietly change how you think about the last hour before you turn off the light. I'm Joshua Smith, and what I'm about to walk you through isn't a trend, and it isn't a product I'm trying to sell you. It's ordinary food, the kind already sitting in your kitchen right now, that a growing body of nutrition research suggests can either work against your brain overnight or actively help it repair itself while you sleep. Here's what most people don't realize. The hours between when you close your eyes and when you open them again are not passive hours for your brain. They're some of the busiest hours it has. Memories get sorted and filed. Waste products get flushed out. Damaged connections get patched up. And what's circulating in your bloodstream during that window, the raw materials your brain has to work with, depends almost entirely on what you ate in the few hours before you went to sleep. For most people over 60, that window is being wasted. Either nothing goes in at all, or what goes in is the wrong thing entirely, and the brain is left to do its most demanding overnight work without the materials it needs. I've spent years looking closely at the intersection of nutrition, science, and aging, and I want to be upfront with you. Nobody sat your grandmother down and explained any of this to her. Most primary care visits don't have time for it. So tonight, we're going to fix that. Before we get into the list, I have to tell you what pulled me into this topic in the first place. A body of sleep and nutrition research has been building for years now, showing that what you eat in the 60 to 90 minutes before bed measurably changes next morning memory performance in adults over 65 compared to eating nothing or eating the wrong things before sleep. We're not talking about a marginal effect. We're talking about a difference that shows up clearly on standard memory testing. That's the gap between walking into a room and remembering why you're there, and standing in the doorway drawing a blank. And here's what I want you to sit with before we get into the full countdown. The number one food on this list, the single most important thing I recommend to people who are serious about protecting their memory as they age, is something a lot of people over 70 have been quietly steering away from for reasons that, frankly, don't hold up anymore. I'll get to it at the end, and I think it's going to surprise you. But first, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your age, and whether you've noticed any changes in your memory or your mental sharpness over the last few years. I read these comments, and they genuinely shape what I cover on this channel. There are a lot of you here quietly taking your brain health seriously, and I want to know who you are. There's a broader piece of biology worth understanding before we start, because it ties every item on this list together. As we age, the brain accumulates something researchers call low-grade neuroinflammation, a kind of chronic background irritation in brain tissue itself. Picture it like a slow buildup of static on a phone line. The signal still gets through, but it's noisier, slower, and more prone to dropping out entirely. This is one of the leading factors nutrition scientists point to when explaining why memory and processing speed decline with age, even in people who are otherwise perfectly healthy. Every food on this list works, at least in part, by addressing that background inflammation, either by feeding the brain's overnight cleanup process directly or by supplying the raw materials it needs to keep neural connections intact. That's the thread running through everything we're about to cover. All right, let's get into it. 5 foods, counted down from 5 to 1, that belong in your evening routine if you're serious about giving your brain what it needs overnight. Starting at number 5, Kiwifruit. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but stay with me. Kiwi is one of the only fruits with a meaningful, naturally occurring concentration of serotonin, the neurotransmitter that your body converts into melatonin as evening falls. Most people think of melatonin only in terms of falling asleep faster, but that undersells what's actually happening. Melatonin isn't just a sleep switch. It's also a surprisingly effective antioxidant inside brain tissue, and it plays a direct role in regulating how much time you spend in deep, slow-wave sleep, which is the stage where the brain does its heaviest lifting on memory consolidation. Here's the aging-specific piece. After 60, your pineal gland, the small structure responsible for producing melatonin, becomes measurably less efficient. Natural nighttime melatonin output in older adults can fall to a fraction of what it was in your 30s and 40s. That's a big part of why so many people over 65 report lighter, more fragmented sleep, even when nothing else in their life has changed. Eating a couple of kiwis in the hour before bed gives your body a natural head start on that pathway, instead of asking a pineal gland that's already working at reduced capacity to do it all on its own. Small human sleep studies have found that adults who ate kiwi nightly for several weeks fell asleep faster, stayed asleep longer, and reported meaningfully better sleep quality compared to those who didn't. Practically, that means 2 kiwis, skin on if you can tolerate it since a lot of the fiber and nutrients sit close to the skin, eaten about 60 minutes before bed. Don't pair them with anything heavy or sugary right before sleep. You want this to be a light, clean signal to your body that the day is winding down, not one more thing for your digestive system to process at full speed. One more thing worth mentioning. Kiwi also carries a meaningful dose of vitamin C and a modest amount of folate, both of which play supporting roles in how efficiently your brain manages oxidative stress overnight. It's a small fruit doing more quiet work than most people give it credit for. Number 4 is low-fat cottage cheese, and I promise you, it deserves a place on this list far more than its reputation suggests. The reason has almost nothing to do with the calcium, and everything to do with the type of protein it contains. Cottage cheese is dominated by casein, a slow-digesting protein that releases amino acids into your bloodstream gradually over 6 to 8 hours instead of all at once. That matters enormously as we age, because of something called anabolic resistance, which is simply the medical term for your body becoming less efficient at using protein as the decades go by. Muscle tissue is the part of this that gets talked about most, but your brain is affected too. Every memory you hold on to physically exists as a pattern of connections between neurons, and maintaining those connections requires a steady supply of amino acids. A fast-digesting protein eaten at dinner is mostly used up and gone within an hour or two. A slow-digesting protein like casein is still feeding your system amino acids at 3 in the morning, right when your brain is deep in its overnight repair cycle. Researchers studying overnight protein feeding in older adults have found that a slow-digesting bedtime protein source measurably improves how much of that protein actually gets put to use overnight compared to eating nothing before bed. A half cup to a full cup of low-fat cottage cheese, eaten about 45 minutes before sleep, is enough to make a real difference. Skip the fruit cup versions loaded with added sugar. If you want to dress it up, a few raspberries or a sprinkle of cinnamon works well without spiking your blood sugar right before bed. Now we get into the top 3, and this is where it starts to get genuinely interesting. At number 3, pumpkin seeds. Not sunflower seeds, not a mixed trail mix, specifically pumpkin seeds, and the reason comes down to one mineral that most people over 60 are quietly running low on without ever being tested for it. I want to tell you about Walter, 76, a retired postal worker from a small town outside Eugene, Oregon. Walter came to me convinced something was seriously wrong. He'd start a task in one room, walk to another room, and completely forget what he'd gone to do. He described it as feeling like his own mind kept closing doors on him mid-thought. His doctor had run the standard panels, told him everything looked normal, and sent him home. When we finally checked his magnesium status more closely, it was low. Not dramatically, but low enough to matter. Magnesium plays a direct role in regulating a receptor in the brain involved in learning and memory called the NMDA receptor. When magnesium runs low, that receptor becomes overactive, which can produce exactly the kind of mental static Walter was describing, that sense of thoughts slipping away before you can grab hold of them. Pumpkin seeds happen to be one of the most magnesium-dense foods that exists, and they also contain a meaningful dose of tryptophan, the same amino acid pathway that feeds into serotonin and melatonin production. After starting on a small nightly handful of pumpkin seeds as part of a broader evening routine, Walter told me a few months later that the closing doors feeling had mostly stopped. I'm careful never to promise outcomes, because everyone's situation is different, but Walter's experience lines up with what the underlying nutrition research on magnesium and aging brains consistently shows. Small handful, about 1 ounce or 2 tablespoons, raw or dry roasted without added salt, works well eaten roughly an hour before bed. If you want to pair it with something, a few slices of banana adds a bit more magnesium and potassium to the mix. Magnesium is also fat-soluble in terms of how well your body absorbs it alongside a small amount of fat, so pairing your pumpkin seeds with the cottage cheese from a couple of hours earlier, rather than eating them in isolation, tends to work especially well if you're building these habits into a full evening routine rather than picking just one. At number 2, we have dark chocolate. Specifically a bar with at least 70% cacao content, and I know that might sound like the last thing anyone would recommend for brain health. But the compounds responsible for chocolate's flavor, called cocoa flavonols, have some of the more interesting research behind them in this entire list. Flavonols have been shown in controlled studies to improve blood flow specifically to the hippocampus, the small seahorse-shaped structure in your brain most responsible for forming new memories. Better blood flow means better delivery of oxygen and glucose right to the tissue, doing the hardest work of memory formation. There's also research connecting cocoa flavonols to increased levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which functions almost like fertilizer for your neurons, supporting the growth and maintenance of the very connections that memories are built on. I want to tell you about Diane, 69, a retired school librarian from Asheville, North Carolina. Diane had always been the person in her friend group who remembered everyone's birthday, every book she'd ever recommended, every detail of a conversation from months earlier. When she started noticing gaps, simple things like forgetting a friend's name mid-sentence, she described it as losing a part of her identity, not just a symptom. After incorporating a small square of dark chocolate into her evening routine alongside a few of the other habits we discussed, she told me during a follow-up conversation that she'd started doing her crossword puzzles again, something she'd quietly given up because they'd become too frustrating to enjoy. 1 to 2 small squares, roughly 15 to 20 grams, of dark chocolate, at least 70% cacao, eaten about 90 minutes before bed, is the amount worth aiming for. Anything less than 70% cacao tends to have a much lower flavonol content and a lot more sugar, which works against the very effect we're going for. Because dark chocolate does contain a small amount of caffeine, if you're especially sensitive to it, move your serving a bit earlier in the evening. And if you've paired it with the pumpkin seeds from a couple hours before, you're combining a magnesium source with a flavonol source in the same evening window, which is exactly the kind of layered approach I recommend when people ask me how to actually build this into a routine rather than treating each food as a one-off fix. This is opening your eyes the way it has for a lot of people I talk to. Take a second right now and hit like and subscribe if you haven't yet. I put out new videos every week, specifically for people who are serious about protecting their independence and their memory as they age, and every subscription genuinely helps this information reach more people who need it. And now, number 1. The food I consider the single most valuable evening addition for long-term brain health, and the one that a lot of people over 70 have been quietly told to avoid in the hours before bed, often for reasons around digestion or cholesterol that modern research just doesn't support the way it used to. That food is fatty fish. Wild salmon, sardines, or mackerel eaten as a light meal roughly 2 hours before sleep. I understand the hesitation. Many of you were told decades ago to be cautious about eating fish or eating anything substantial late in the day. I'd ask you to set that concern aside for a moment while I walk you through why the evidence on this specific point has shifted so much. Fatty fish is the richest direct dietary source of DHA and EPA, the two omega-3 fats that aren't just helpful for brain function, they're structurally part of it. Your brain is roughly 60% fat by dry weight, and DHA makes up a significant share of that. Every neuron's outer membrane depends on it. Every synapse, the physical junction where a memory is stored, relies on membranes built substantially from DHA to function properly. Here's the piece that matters most as you get older. Your body's ability to convert plant-based omega-3s, the kind found in walnuts or flaxseed, into the DHA your brain can actually use, declines significantly after age 60. That means relying only on plant sources leaves most older adults working with far less usable DHA than they need. Direct dietary DHA from fatty fish becomes much more important to close that gap. This connects to something called the glymphatic system, your brain's overnight waste clearance network, which activates most fully during deep sleep and flushes out metabolic byproducts that build up during the day. That clearance process works more efficiently when brain cell membranes are well supplied with DHA, because healthier, more flexible membranes allow fluid to move through brain tissue more freely. Beyond the omega-3s, wild salmon in particular contains astaxanthin, a carotenoid antioxidant capable of crossing into brain tissue, where it appears to support mitochondrial function inside neurons, the tiny structures responsible for generating cellular energy. As we age, those mitochondria naturally become less efficient, and anything that supports their function is worth paying attention to. Fatty fish also happens to be one of the best dietary sources of vitamin D3 and vitamin B12, two nutrients that a large share of adults over 65 are quietly deficient in, and both of which have well-established roles in cognitive health. Perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence here comes from the long-running Mind Diet research out of Rush University, which found that older adults who regularly included fish in their diet showed meaningfully slower rates of age-related cognitive decline over years of follow-up compared to those who rarely ate it. A 4-ounce serving of salmon a couple of evenings a week, prepared simply, baked, steamed, or lightly pan-seared rather than fried, is enough to make a genuine difference over time. Keep the portion light if you're eating close to bedtime, and give yourself roughly 2 hours before you lie down so digestion isn't competing with sleep onset. If salmon isn't practical for you every week, sardines are a genuinely underrated substitute. They carry a similar omega-3 profile, they're inexpensive, and because you're eating the small bones along with the flesh, you're getting a meaningful amount of calcium and vitamin D in the same bite. I'd rather see someone eat sardines twice a week consistently than aim for salmon once a month and let the habit slide. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss next week's video, and if someone you love is over 60, send this one their way. It might change how they think about their evening routine, the same way it's changed things for so many people watching right now. Let me know in the comments which of these 5 you're going to try first tonight.